Hey everyone, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to step back in time, way back, to explore the surprisingly busy, occasionally strange, and relentlessly demanding life of our Paleolithic ancestors. What did people actually do all day in the Stone Age? It turns out, their lives were far more complex and interesting than the simple montages of rock smashing and fire discovery we often imagine. So before we get started on this journey, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive into our shared past, take a quick moment to like the video and subscribe. It genuinely helps support what I do here. And as always, I'd love to know where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's a constant source of fascination to see our global community coming together. All right, find a comfortable spot, maybe dim the lights, and let's ease into the world of the Paleolithic. The day for a Stone Age human didn't begin with an alarm clock. It began with the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, cues of the natural world. The first gray light of dawn filtering through the entrance of a cave or the gaps in a hide-covered hut was one signal. Another might be the wind picking up, its mournful howl a stark reminder of the cold just beyond your thin shelter. Or perhaps the trigger was more intimate, the sound of someone nearby erupting into a fit of coughing, a common rattling sound in the damp, smoky air of a communal living space. You weren't sleeping on a memory foam mattress. Most people rested on packed earth, which retained the day's chill, or on a bed of carefully collected animal hides. A particularly well-off group might have a layer of dried grass, leaves, or soft moss beneath them, a small luxury that provided a bit of padding and insulation. You would have slept huddled close to the heart of your small world, the fire. This wasn't for ambience or rustic charm. It was a matter of life and death. The flickering flames offered precious heat against the biting cold of the night, and its glow was the only thing that kept the creeping darkness, along with the predators that lived in it, at bay. The scent of wood smoke was a constant, clinging to your hair, your clothes, and your very skin. It was the perfume of survival. Sleeping alone was not an option. To separate yourself from the group was to paint a target on your back. You slept in a tight, tangled cluster of bodies, your immediate family, your extended kin, and whoever else made up the local band, a group that might number 20 to 40 individuals. Privacy, as we understand it, was a completely alien concept. There were no bedroom doors, no walls to muffle sound. Every cough, every sigh, every whispered word, every argument, every moment of intimacy was a semi-public event. The community was a single breathing organism, and you were just one small part of its warmth and its noise. You knew who snored, who talked in their sleep, and who was suffering from a bad stomach. This profound lack of personal space wasn't a flaw in their society. It was a feature, a necessary trade-off for the collective security that kept you alive through another night. Waking up to find all your limbs intact was the first victory of the day, and it was a victory won by the simple act of staying together. The thought of wandering off to sleep, under the stars by yourself, was not a romantic dream of solitude. It was a terrifying, almost suicidal fantasy. Now, let's talk about something we modern humans are often obsessed with: personal hygiene. In the Paleolithic era, cleanliness existed, but it was driven by practicality, not aesthetics. The goal wasn't to smell like a spring meadow or to have perfectly coiffed hair. It was to keep yourself functional and to manage the unavoidable grime of daily life. You cleaned yourself when the dirt started to interfere with your ability to work, when pests became unbearable, or when your personal odor became a genuine problem for the rest of the group. Bathing, in the sense of a full-body wash, was a seasonal luxury. If your band lived near a river, a stream, or a lake, people would certainly wash in it, but only when the weather was warm enough. Plunging into icy water in the middle of a harsh winter wasn't just unpleasant. It was a good way to invite hypothermia. During those long, cold months, cleaning was a much more localized affair. It might involve wiping down your skin with handfuls of damp moss, scraping off caked-on mud with a flat stone, or using handfuls of dry sand to exfoliate away dirt and dead skin. It was about maintenance, not indulgence. One of the more surprising cleaning agents was animal fat. It sounds completely counterintuitive to us, scrubbing yourself with grease, but it served multiple purposes. Rubbing rendered animal fat onto the skin could help lift and remove embedded dirt. But more importantly, a thin layer of fat acted as a barrier against the cold and, to some extent, a repellent for biting insects. It was a primitive form of lotion, moisturizer, and bug spray all in one. So while it might not leave you feeling squeaky clean, it left you better protected, which was the far more important metric. What about teeth? There were no toothbrushes, no mint-flavored paste. Dental hygiene was mechanical. People, including some of our hominin ancestors, are known to have chewed on fibrous sticks, fraying the ends to create a primitive brush to clean their teeth. Gnawing on bones could also help scrape away food particles. The Paleolithic diet was tough on teeth, but not in the way we think of today. Their food involved coarse, unprocessed plants, tough meat that required a lot of chewing, and a significant amount of grit and sand that got mixed in during food preparation on grinding stones. This led to extreme dental wear. Teeth were often ground down to stumps over a lifetime. But here's the twist. Cavities were surprisingly rare. Without refined sugars and carbohydrates, the bacteria that cause tooth decay had little to feast on. So, while you might lose a tooth to an injury or simply wear it down to the gum line, you were unlikely to suffer from a sugar-induced cavity. Hair care was, for the most part, minimal. Hair was generally worn long, sometimes tied back with a leather thong or a strip of vine to keep it out of the eyes during a hunt or while working. For many, it was simply ignored, and with hair comes lice. These pests were a constant, unwelcome companion. Archaeological evidence from later periods shows that some groups may have used concoctions of ash clay or specific animal oils to try and reduce infestations, but the most common method was probably the most timeless. A lot of scratching and hoping for the best. Primitive combs made from bone or wood have been found, but these appear later in the prehistoric record, suggesting that grooming was a practice that evolved over time. Of course, your clothing didn't help matters. Animal hides, while effective insulators, are not breathable. They trap sweat and odors, and they certainly weren't washed often, if at all. The smell of cured leather, old sweat, and wood smoke was the standard human scent. Feet were often bare, or at best, wrapped in pieces of hide tied with sinew. As you can imagine, after a long day of tracking animals across miles of terrain, the aroma inside a prehistoric shelter was ... distinctive. It was a complex bouquet of unwashed bodies, smoking meat, damp earth, and burning wood. But here's the crucial thing to remember. Despite the lack of soap and showers, early humans were incredibly resilient. Their immune systems were robust, and communities likely understood enough about basic sanitation, like not defecating near their water source, to avoid catastrophic outbreaks. And since everyone smelled more or less the same, no one really noticed or cared. Unless you did something truly extreme, like intentionally rolling in a dead animal to camouflage your scent for a hunt. In that case, you were probably asked to sleep a little farther from the fire. So, what about breakfast? There was no set time for the morning meal, no cheerful call of breakfast is ready, ringing through the camp. In the Paleolithic world, you ate when you could, what you could, and often only if there was anything left over from the day before. The concept of 3 square meals a day was a distant, unimaginable luxury. Imagine waking up, the familiar chill of dawn in the air. You stretch, and your first thought isn't about the day's tasks, but a more primal one. Hunger. Your eyes scan the small camp. If you were lucky, incredibly lucky, last night S hunt was successful, and the group was disciplined enough not to eat everything in one sitting. In this best-case scenario, you might see a strip of dried or smoked meat still hanging from a wooden rack near the fire. Or perhaps there's a large bone, cracked open from the night before, with a little bit of precious fatty marrow still waiting to be scraped out. If you woke up to a sight like that, congratulations. You had just won the prehistoric lottery. But most mornings didn't start that way. Far more often, the hunt had failed, or the food from the previous day had been entirely consumed. Or, in a scenario that has plagued humans for millennia, it might have been stolen overnight by a bold raccoon-like creature with a bit too much ambition. In that case, breakfast wasn't a meal, it was a mission. It meant immediate foraging. This wasn't a leisurely walk in the woods. It was a focused, urgent search for calories. The first and most reliable option was often digging. Armed with a sturdy stick or a flat stone, you might start digging for edible roots and tubers. These were the underground savings accounts of the plant world, starchy, filling, and available year-round if you knew where to look. While you were digging, you'd also be scanning the landscape for anything else. Depending on the season, this could mean checking nearby berry bush, hoping to find a few last, sweet morsels that the birds hadn't claimed. You'd look for edible greens in the spring, wild fruits in the summer, and nuts in the autumn. Winter, however, mostly just brought hunger. The choices were dictated entirely by the environment, and the competition was fierce. You weren't just competing with other humans. You were competing with every animal and every hungry child in the vicinity. Protein was a more unpredictable prize. While the main hunting party prepared for a larger expedition, early morning foraging might yield a few small but vital sources of protein. You might stumble upon a bird's nest and collect the eggs, or if you were quick and quiet, catch a small lizard or a frog. Insects were another crucial, if unappetizing, part of the menu. They were a reliable, readily available protein source, even if nobody was particularly excited about eating them. Flipping over a log might reveal a handful of grubs. Breaking into a termite mound could provide a swarming, crawling feast. They might not have tasted great, but they were packed with nutrients, and most importantly, they didn't fight back. Food, especially in the morning, was a resource, not a courtesy. While you would almost certainly share within your immediate family, there was no guarantee of a camp-wide breakfast buffet. If someone returned to the group with a handful of berries or a roasted squirrel, it meant they were either feeling particularly generous, they were in a position of authority, or maybe both. Water was the other morning priority. If you were lucky, a clean stream or river flowed nearby. If not, stagnant puddles or collected rainwater had to suffice. Boiling water wasn't a common practice yet, so most water was consumed raw, carrying with it a host of invisible bacteria. Your gut was in a constant battle, and every drink was a gamble that it would either defeat the pathogens or deeply, deeply regret the attempt. So every morning was a new roll of the dice. Maybe you'd find a few nuts, a handful of bitter roots, and a couple of crunchy beetles. Maybe you find nothing at all and have to push through the hunger until a larger hunt or a foraging party returned later in the day. Either way, one thing was certain. No one skipped breakfast on purpose. All right, so breakfast has either been dealt with, or you've accepted it's not happening just yet. The gnawing emptiness in your stomach is a familiar companion. What's next? You can't hunt or process anything without the right gear. The next major task of the day, and one that consumed a surprising amount of time, was tool maintenance. In our world, tools are things we buy from a store. In the Paleolithic world, your tools were your lifeline. They weren't just accessories. They were a direct extension of your body, your teeth, your claws, your shield. Without a good, sharp edge, you couldn't butcher an animal, scrape a hide clean, carve a piece of wood, or defend yourself from the numerous things that wanted to eat you. Losing your tools or letting them fall into disrepair wasn't an inconvenience. it was a crisis. So, a significant portion of the morning was often spent hunched over, engrossed in the meticulous and sometimes frustrating art of stone tool making, a practice we now call flint knapping. Welcome to the Paleolithic workshop. There's no workbench, no safety goggles, just a designated patch of ground littered with stone flakes. The air is filled with the sharp, percussive tink, tink, clack of rocks hitting other rocks. It's part craftsmanship, part physics, and entirely dependent on not smashing your thumb into a pulp. The raw material of choice was a type of stone that fractured in a predictable way. The gold standard was flint, or a similar rock called chert. These stones, when struck correctly, break with what's called a conchoidal fracture, meaning they shear off in curved, shell-like flakes with incredibly sharp edges. If you were lucky enough to live near a volcanic region, you might have access to obsidian. Obsidian was the high-end sports car of rocks, a black, volcanic glass that could be flaked to create an edge sharper than a modern surgical scalpel. The process itself was a delicate dance of force and finesse. You'd hold a core stone in one hand and strike it with a hammerstone, a harder, rounder rock at just the right angle and with just the right amount of force. The goal was to detach a flake of the desired size and shape. It required immense focus and an intuitive understanding of the stone's internal structure. A master knapper could read a rock, seeing the potential tools hidden within its flaws and fissures. But for every perfect flake, there were dozens of failures. You could spend an hour meticulously preparing a core, only to have it shatter into a useless pile of sharp gravel with one misplaced strike. You didn't complain. You didn't throw a tantrum. You just sighed, picked up another rock, and started over. The basic Paleolithic toolkit, your personal survival pack, included a few key items. The hand axe was the iconic multi-tool, a teardrop-shaped stone that could be used for chopping wood, butchering large animals, and digging. Scrapers were smaller, flatter tools with a steep edge, essential for the tedious but vital work of scraping fat and tissue from animal hides. And of course, there were spearheads, sharp, pointed flakes that were the business end of your primary hunting weapon. Most people could make their own basic tools, but like any craft, some individuals were true masters. There was always that one person in the band who had the magic touch, the one who could knock out a perfectly symmetrical, brutally effective spear point, almost every time. That person earned a special kind of respect. Their skill wasn't just admired, it was essential to the group's success. You'd often go to them to get a new spearhead, but it wasn't a free service. You probably owed them a favor, a share of the next hunt, or something else of value. This was a quiet economy of skill and reciprocity. Making the tool was just step one. Maintaining it was a constant job. A dull edge was useless and worse, dangerous. A dull scraper could rip a valuable hide. A dull spear might glance off a bison's thick coat instead of piercing it. So every day involved resharpening, a process called retouching, where you'd use a softer tool, like a piece of antler or bone, to press off tiny flakes along the edge, honing it to razor sharpness. And every now and then, creativity sparked a revolution. Someone somewhere had the brilliant idea to tie a rock to a stick with strips of animal sinew, creating the first hammer or axe with a handle. This simple act of hafting multiplied the force you could generate. Others discovered that bone, antler, and ivory could be shaped into tools as well. These materials were more flexible and could be worked into finer points, creating the first needles for sewing hides, awls for punching holes, and deadly, barbed harpoon points for fishing. These small innovations were the seeds of all later technology, born from the simple, daily need to cut, scrape, and survive. Hey everyone, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to step back in time, way back, to explore the surprisingly busy, occasionally strange, and relentlessly demanding life of our Paleolithic ancestors. What did people actually do all day in the Stone Age? It turns out Their lives were far more complex and interesting than the simple montages of rock smashing and fire discovery we often imagine. So before we get started on this journey, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive into our shared past, take a quick moment to like the video and subscribe. It genuinely helps support what I do here. And as always, I'd love to know where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's a constant source of fascination to see our global community coming together. All right, find a comfortable spot, maybe dim the lights, and let's ease into the world of the Paleolithic. The day for a Stone Age human didn't begin with an alarm clock. It began with the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, cues of the natural world. The first gray light of dawn filtering through the entrance of a cave or the gaps in a hide-covered hut was one signal. Another might be the wind picking up, its mournful howl a stark reminder of the cold just beyond your thin shelter. Or perhaps the trigger was more intimate, the sound of someone nearby erupting into a fit of coughing, a common rattling sound in the damp, smoky air of a communal living space. You weren't sleeping on a memory foam mattress. Most people rested on packed earth, which retained the day's chill, or on a bed of carefully collected animal hides. A particularly well-off group might have a layer of dried grass, leaves, or soft moss beneath them, a small luxury that provided a bit of padding and insulation. You would have slept huddled close to the heart of your small world, the fire. This wasn't for ambience or rustic charm. It was a matter of life and death. The flickering flames offered precious heat against the biting cold of the night, and its glow was the only thing that kept the creeping darkness, along with the predators that lived in it, at bay. The scent of wood smoke was a constant, clinging to your hair, your clothes, and your very skin. It was the perfume of survival. Sleeping alone was not an option. To separate yourself from the group was to paint a target on your back. You slept in a tight, tangled cluster of bodies, your immediate family, your extended kin, and whoever else made up the local band, a group that might number 20 to 40 individuals. Privacy, as we understand it, was a completely alien concept. There were no bedroom doors, no walls to muffle sound. Every cough, every sigh, every whispered word, every argument, every moment of intimacy was a semi-public event. The community was a single breathing organism, and you were just one small part of its warmth and its noise. You knew who snored, who talked in their sleep, and who was suffering from a bad stomach. This profound lack of personal space wasn't a flaw in their society. It was a feature, a necessary trade-off for the collective security that kept you alive through another night. Waking up to find all your limbs intact was the first victory of the day, and it was a victory won by the simple act of staying together. The thought of wandering off to sleep, under the stars by yourself, was not a romantic dream of solitude. It was a terrifying, almost suicidal fantasy. Let's shift our focus to the hunt. But before we get to the giant, dramatic prey, let's talk about the more common, everyday pursuit of smaller game. While a mammoth or a bison was the ultimate prize, these large-scale hunts were risky, infrequent, and far from guaranteed. On a day-to-day basis, the protein that kept the group going often came from much smaller, more manageable animals. This was the bread-and-butter hunting that filled the gaps between the big, glorious kills. The targets were varied: rabbits, hares, birds of all kinds, squirrels, marmots, and even smaller predators like foxes. Hunting these creatures was a different kind of challenge. It wasn't about overwhelming a massive beast with brute force. It was about stealth, speed, and precision. A lone hunter or a small group of 2 or 3 might head out from the camp, moving with a quiet focus that had been honed since childhood. The primary weapon for this kind of hunt was the spear. But these weren't just sharpened sticks. A well-made Paleolithic spear was a sophisticated tool. It had a fire-hardened tip, or even better, a lethally sharp, flaked stone point that was carefully bound to the shaft with animal sinew and adhesive. Made from pine resin, some groups developed a revolutionary piece of technology, the atlatl, or spear thrower. This was essentially a wooden stick with a hook at one end that cradled the spear. By using the atlatl, a hunter could dramatically increase the leverage and velocity of their throw, effectively turning their arm into a much longer, more powerful limb. A spear thrown with an atlatl could travel faster, farther, and with much greater killing force than one thrown by hand alone. It was a game changer, allowing hunters to strike from a safer distance and with more deadly accuracy. Clubs were another straightforward but effective tool. A heavy, well-balanced piece of wood could be used to dispatch a cornered animal quickly. But hunting wasn't just about active pursuit. Paleolithic people were masters of passive hunting as well. Traps and snares were ingenious, low-effort, high-reward tools. A hunter might spend part of his morning setting up a series of simple but effective snares along a no-rabbit trail. These could be made from plaited plant fibers or strips of leather, designed to catch an animal by the leg or neck. Other traps might involve precariously balanced rocks or logs, set to fall on any creature that disturbed a trigger mechanism. Setting up a trap line was an investment. You'd set the traps in the morning and then check them later in the day, or the next morning, hoping to find a meal waiting for you. Even with smaller animals, things could go wrong. A rabbit might be faster than you think, diving into its burrow just as your spear arrives. A bird might take flight a split second before you're ready. And some small game wasn't so small or harmless. A wild boar, for instance, is not a creature to be taken lightly. Though not a mammoth, an adult boar is fast, powerful, and armed with sharp tusks. One wrong move, one moment of carelessness, and a hunt for a pig could easily turn into you being the one running for your life through the dense underbrush, trying to come up with a good story to explain to your group how you almost had it. When a hunt for small game was successful, the payoff was immediate. A few rabbits or a large bird could be quickly brought back to camp, skinned and cooked over the fire, providing a much-needed boost of protein and fat for the group. The hunter who brought back the food earned respect. It was a tangible contribution to the well-being of the band. It showed skill, patience, and an understanding of the natural world. The act of hunting, even for these smaller creatures, was more than just a way to get food. It was a constant reinforcement of essential skills. It taught youngsters how to track, how to move silently, how to read the wind, and how to understand animal behavior. It was a hands-on education in the art of survival. The sounds of the forest, the snap of a twig, the call of a bird, all of these were pieces of information to a skilled hunter. This relentless, everyday pursuit of small game kept the hunters sharp, their skills honed, and their families fed, ensuring that the band had the energy and resilience to survive until the next great hunt. Now for the main event. The hunt that legends are made of, the one that would be retold around the fire for weeks to come. This was the hunt for megafauna, the giant beasts of the Pleistocene. We're talking about woolly mammoths, steppe bison, giant elk, and wild horses. Bringing down one of these animals wasn't just a way to get food. It was a monumental undertaking that could feed an entire band for a week or more, providing not just meat, but also hides for shelter and clothing, bones for tools and structures, and fat for fuel and preservation. A successful megafauna hunt was the ultimate jackpot, but it was also incredibly dangerous. This wasn't a solo activity. Hunting a mammoth was a full-team operation, requiring the skill, courage, and coordination of every able-bodied hunter in the group. There was probably even that one guy who wasn't a great hunter, but was really good at shouting useful things from a safe distance, like, "Go left," or the ever-helpful, "That's not a deer." The process began long before any spears were thrown. It started with planning and intelligence gathering. Scouts would be sent out, sometimes for days at a time, to track the great herds. They had to understand the animals' migration patterns, their daily routines, and their preferred grazing spots. The goal was to find a herd, assess its size and the health of the animals, and identify a potential target, often a younger, older, or isolated individual that might be easier to separate from the protection of the group. Once a target was identified, the hunters would formulate a strategy. They were masters of using the landscape to their advantage. They would look for natural traps. A narrow ravine or a box canyon could be used to funnel the animal and restrict its movement. A steep cliff edge presented a high-risk, high-reward opportunity for a cliff drive, where the hunters would try to panic the herd and stampede them over the edge. This was a brutal but incredibly effective method that could yield a massive amount of food at once. If the terrain was flat and open, they might resort to digging pit traps, large, deep holes disguised with branches and leaves, placed along a known game trail. When the moment of the ambush arrived, it was a scene of controlled chaos. The plan would be put into motion with a sudden explosion of noise and movement. Hunters would emerge from their hiding places, yelling, waving their arms, and using noisemakers to startle and confuse the herd. The aim was to create panic, crucially, to separate their chosen target from the others. A lone, terrified mammoth was still incredibly dangerous, but it was far more manageable than a defensive herd. Then came the attack. The hunters would close in, a ring of determined figures armed with heavy stone-tipped spears. This wasn't about a single clean kill shot. It was a battle of attrition. They would dart in, thrusting their spears into the animal's flanks and underbelly, aiming for areas that would cause bleeding and slow the creature down. They would then retreat quickly to avoid the thrashing tusks and powerful trunk. It was a deadly dance, a constant cycle of attack and evasion. The ground would be trembling, the air filled with the trumpeting cries of the animal and the shouts of the men. The hope was that the great beast would eventually weaken from blood loss and exhaustion, and finally collapse. Of course, this was the ideal scenario. Things frequently went wrong. A mammoth was a 10-ton mountain of muscle and fury. It wasn't going to stand around and wait to be speared. These animals were fast, surprisingly agile, and they had absolutely no patience for small, hairless bipeds with pointy sticks. A hunter who tripped or was too slow to get out of the way could be trampled or gored in an instant. The line between hunter and hunted was perilously thin. If the hunt was successful, the work was far from over. The real labor began after the animal was down. Butchering a creature the size of a mammoth was a colossal task that required the entire community's effort. The meat had to be stripped from the bones, the valuable organs collected, and the massive hide carefully removed. The meat would be carried back to camp in huge quantities, where it would be eaten fresh, smoked, or dried for long-term storage. The bones would be used for tools, needles, and even as structural supports for shelters. The fat would be rendered for fuel, or mixed with berries to make pemmican, a high-energy survival food. Nothing was wasted. The hunting party would return to camp not just with food, but with status. The hunter who struck the killing blow, or who played the most critical role in the hunt, would earn immense respect, a larger share of the meat, and bragging rights that would last for a very long time. Sharing the kill was still the norm. You needed your group to survive, but a successful mammoth hunt cemented a hunter's reputation as a provider and a leader. It was a story of teamwork, risk, and strategy, all played out on a terrifying, epic scale. If there was one thing that transformed the bleak, precarious existence of Paleolithic life into something manageable, it was fire. Fire was the anchor of the community, the beating heart of the camp. It cooked your food, turning tough, raw meat into a safe and digestible meal. It kept you warm, pushing back the relentless cold that could steal the life from you as you slept. It scared off the predators that prowled in the darkness, their eyes glowing just beyond the circle of light. And it allowed you to see, to work, and to connect with each other after the sun had set. Without fire, your odds of survival plummeted dramatically. And for that very reason, every single person in the group understood the unspoken, absolute rule: you do not let the fire go out. Someone, usually whoever was youngest, drew the short straw, or was otherwise assigned the task that day, was put on fire duty. This wasn't a glamorous job. It involved long stretches of quiet observation, keeping a constant, careful eye on the flames. You had to feed it, but not too much at once. You had to know which would burn slow and hot, and which would just produce a lot of smoke. You had to watch for a sudden shift in the wind that might send sparks flying towards your dry, hide-covered shelter. And if you looked over and saw that the vibrant, dancing flames had dwindled to a few dim, sullen coals, a jolt of panic would go through you. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a group-wide emergency. Starting a fire from scratch was a monumental effort. It wasn't as simple as striking a match. It required skill, patience, and a lot of physical work. The most common method involved friction. This could be a fire drill, where you'd rapidly spin a wooden spindle in a notch on a fireboard, creating friction and heat until a tiny, glowing ember was born. Or it could be a fire plow, where you'd rub a stick back and forth in a groove of wood. Either way, if your hands were cold and numb, or if you tindered the small bundle of dry grass, shredded bark, or fungus you used to catch the ember was even slightly damp, you could be there for what felt like an eternity, your muscles aching, desperately hoping that a wisp of smoke would appear. This difficulty is why many groups went to extraordinary lengths to keep a single, continuous fire alive, sometimes for months or even years. When the band had to move camp, preserving the fire was a top priority. In some cases, someone was given the incredibly important job of firebearer. This person would carefully wrap a glowing coal or a piece of slow-burning fungus in a container of green leaves or moss, and carry it with them on the journey. This person had one job: protect the ember. The pressure was immense. Of course, a fire needs fuel, and fuel collection was a constant daily chore. Dry wood was the best, but you also had to gather kindling, smaller twigs, and flammable material to get it started. In areas where wood was scarce, people used other resources. Dried animal dung burned surprisingly well, and was a staple fuel source on the open steppes. Children were often tasked with helping to gather fuel, though they sometimes brought back things that looked flammable, but absolutely were not, like a wet, mossy log or a half-buried mushroom. The fire was more than just a tool. It was the social center of camp life. It was the original living room, the community's hearth. At the end of a long day, everyone would gather around its warmth. It was here that they shared their food, their stories, and their worries. It was here that they argued about whose turn it was to stand watch for the night. The fire pit was the stage for social life. Friendships were forged, alliances were tested, and children listened, wide-eyed, to the tales of their elders. The fire was a silent witness to it all. No one ever got praised for successfully keeping the fire going. It was an expected, fundamental duty. But if you were the one on watch and you fell asleep, letting the precious flames die out, there would be no excuses. There would only be the cold, hard reality of the morning, a lot of angry, shivering glares, and the unspoken but universally understood sentence: guess who's spending the rest of the day making sparks? The classic image of a caveman is, of course, a person living in a cave. And while caves were certainly prime real estate in the Paleolithic world, they weren't always available. A good cave offered natural shelter from the wind and rain, built-in, walls for protection, and a stable temperature. But they were a limited resource. You had to be in a region that had them, and you had to hope that another group of humans, or worse, a very large and territorial cave bear, hadn't already claimed it. So, like any resourceful and determined human group, our ancestors often had to build their own homes. Construction in the Paleolithic era wasn't about aesthetics or following blueprints. There were no architects, no building codes, and certainly no homeowners association to complain about the lopsided look of your hut. The primary goal was brutally simple: keep the weather out and keep the people inside relatively warm and dry. The design was dictated by the local environment and the materials at hand. If you were in a wooded area, your primary building materials would be wood and branches. You'd create a simple framework of sturdy branches, driven into the ground, perhaps, bent and lashed together at the top to form a dome or a cone shape. In the vast, treeless steppes of Ice Age Europe, the skeletons of the great beasts they hunted became the architecture. The massive, curved ribs of a woolly mammoth could be used to create a strong, durable framework for a hut. These bone structures were a testament to the ingenuity of the people, turning the remains of their greatest prey into their homes. Once the framework was up, it had to be covered. This is where animal hides came in. The skins of bison deer or horses would be stretched over the frame and sewn or tied together with animal sinew or tough plant fibers. In other areas, large sheets of bark could be used, or a mixture of mud, grass, and clay could be packed onto the frame to create a form of wattle and daub. The end result was often a lopsided, semi-permanent structure that probably leaked a bit less than just standing out in the rain. Building was a group effort. It had to be. One person couldn't raise a mammoth rib hut on their own. It was a community project. One group of people would hold the heavy posts or bones in place. Another would do the difficult work of tying the lashings tight. And there was probably someone standing nearby, arms crossed, offering helpful but unsolicited advice. If the structure collapsed halfway through construction, nobody was surprised. You didn't despair. You just picked up the pieces, maybe grumbled a bit, and tried again. This time with an extra stick for support. Weather was the constant enemy. A heavy rain could turn the packed earth floor into a soupy mud pit. A strong wind could threaten to rip the hide coverings right off the frame, like nature was trying to aggressively redecorate. And a heavy snowfall could crush an entire shelter if it wasn't properly reinforced. This is why some groups were seasonally nomadic, building different types of structures for different times of the year. They might have lightweight, easily assembled summer huts that could be abandoned without a second thought, and then more robust, semi-subterranean winter shelters dug partially into the ground for better insulation against the long, miserable stretches of frozen time. Insulation was the ultimate luxury. If you were lucky, you had a good supply of animal hides to cover not just the walls, but the floor as well, creating a barrier against the cold, damp earth. If not, you just layered up in your fur cloaks, huddled closer to the fire, and complained about the draft. The fire, as always, stayed in the center of the dwelling. Ideally, there was a hole in the roof to let the smoke escape, but this design feature usually let in just as much cold air and rain as it let out smoke. And what about furniture? A concept didn't really exist. You had a rock to sit on, a relatively flat spot on the floor to nap, and maybe a communal pile of hides and furs in the corner for sleeping. True luxury wasn't a soft bed. It was a warm, dry corner with no drafts and a roof that didn't drip directly onto your head. And yet, even with these limited materials and constant challenges, prehistoric people managed to build homes that worked. They weren't pretty, they weren't permanent, but they kept you alive, dry-ish, and on a good day, upright during a windstorm. They were a testament to human adaptability and the universal drive to create a safe place to call home. Parenting in the modern world can feel overwhelming, but it comes with a vast support system. Manuals, online forums, pediatricians, and an endless supply of baby products. Now, imagine parenting in the Paleolithic era. There were no guidebooks, no podcasts on toddler discipline, and definitely no all-terrain baby strollers. From the moment a child was born, you were immediately and entirely responsible for keeping a small, loud, and incredibly fragile human being alive in a world that was actively hostile to them. The landscape was full of cliffs to fall off of, predators to be snatched by, and sharp rocks to trip over. And you had to navigate all of this without losing your only spear or your sanity. Childbirth itself was a dangerous, communal event. It was painful, messy, and carried a high risk for both mother and child. If you survived, congratulations. Now the real challenge began. Keeping your newborn warm, fed, and most importantly, away from the fire. A baby's natural curiosity was a constant threat. They would try to touch the glowing embers, chew on a sharp stone tool, or crawl out of the shelter into the path of something dangerous. There were no diapers. Babies were swaddled in soft animal hides or absorbent plant fibers like moss, and messes were simply a part of the job. You learned very quickly to always set them down on a pile of leaves or on a large, flat rock for easier cleanup. Mothers typically breastfed their children for several years. There was no baby formula, and the alternative chewing tough meat into a soft pulp for a toddler was not a particularly efficient or appealing process. Nursing provided not just essential nutrition, but also critical antibodies that helped protect the child from diseases in their environment. Discipline was immediate and practical. There were no timeouts or lengthy discussions about feelings. If a child wandered too close to a steep drop-off, you didn't reason with them. You grabbed them by the leg, pulled them back, and probably barked something that translated to "no fall." The stakes were simply too high for gentle persuasion. Safety rules had to be learned, and learned fast. Touching the fire, chasing after a snake, or trying to eat a brightly colored, unknown berry were all considered teachable moments, and you hoped that the lesson was learned before anything exploded, bit back, or caused terrifying hallucinations. But Paleolithic parenting wasn't just a constant state of high-alert anxiety. Children played. In fact, they played constantly. Their toys were the world around them: sticks, stones, feathers, interesting bugs, and mud. Lots and lots of mud. Play wasn't just for fun. It was how they learned. The child who developed a good throwing arm by skipping rocks across a river might one day become the tribe's best hunter. The kid who sat quietly for hours, watching the elders flake stone tools, might develop the patience and skill to become a master craftsperson. The one who seemed to have an intuitive sense of which plants were, which might become a skilled forager or healer. No one asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" You simply became something, depending on your aptitudes, your survival skills, and a healthy dose of luck. Older children were expected to contribute. They weren't just mouths to feed. They were functional members of the group. They helped with chores like gathering kindling, fetching water from the stream, or chasing birds away from the meat that was drying in the sun. By the time they were 10 years old, they were considered semi-functional members of society. They were probably still annoying, but now they were usefully annoying. There was no formal education, no classrooms or teachers. Children learned through a hands-on, immersive curriculum of observation, repetition, and trial by fire, sometimes literally. They didn't have a toy box. They had nature. And nature didn't come with safety labels or padded corners. They learned the rhythms of the seasons, the names of the plants, the tracks of the animals, and their place within the small, tightly knit world of their band. It was a tough, demanding childhood, but it produced resilient, resourceful, and incredibly knowledgeable adults who were capable of surviving in a world that we can barely imagine. Getting sick or injured in the Paleolithic era was a terrifying gamble. It was like rolling a set of dice with the universe. Only the dice were carved from bone, and most of the sides had a bad outcome painted on them. There were no hospitals, no antibiotics, no sterile operating rooms, and definitely no urgent care clinics. If you fell and broke your leg, got a deep cut from a stone tool, or came down with a mysterious fever and a nasty rash, you were facing a true crisis. The best case scenario was that your own body's immune system was strong enough to handle it. The worst case scenario, well, that involved the rest of the group gathering awkwardly around your spot by the fire, hoping that whatever you had wasn't contagious. Medical care did exist, but it was basic, intuitive, and deeply intertwined with the natural world. Early humans undoubtedly had a working knowledge of folk medicine. They would have known which plants could help reduce pain or soothe inflammation. We have archaeological evidence to suggest this. For example, chewing on willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in modern aspirin, could have served as a primitive pain reliever. Imagine a Paleolithic person with a throbbing headache, gnawing on a bitter piece of bark and discovering, through sheer trial and error, one of humanity's first painkillers. They would have also used crushed herbs, poultices of clay, or specific leaves to treat wounds and skin ailments. For a serious wound, like a deep gash from a hunting accident, treatment was a race against infection. The first step was to clean the area as best as possible, probably with water from a stream or by applying plants that were known to have antiseptic properties. The wound would then be wrapped, perhaps in a layer of clean moss, soft animal hide, or large leaves, to keep it protected from dirt. But there were no sterile bandages, no antibacterial ointment. Infection was the real killer, not always the initial injury itself. If the wound got red, hot, swollen, and started to smell bad, everyone knew that was the smell of very bad news. Broken bones were another common and life-threatening injury. Sometimes they healed. There is clear archaeological evidence of this. Skeletons of prehistoric individuals have been found with well-healed fractures, including severe breaks to leg and arm bones. This is incredibly significant because it proves that these individuals were not abandoned. For a bone to heal properly, the person would have had to be immobilized and cared for by their group for weeks, if not months. They would have been fed, kept warm, and protected. It's a powerful testament to the compassion and social cohesion of these early human bands. But of course, there were also many cases where bones healed improperly, leaving the person with a permanent disability. And many people likely kept moving on a bad limb because they had no other choice, which only made the injury worse. Toothaches were a constant, nagging misery. As we discussed, teeth wore down from the tough, gritty diet, while cavities weren't. A huge problem. Abscesses and jaw infections certainly were. If a tooth became badly infected, the pain would have been excruciating. The only solution was removal, and that meant using a sturdy stick to pry it out, or, in a more brutal approach, placing a rock against the tooth and giving it a sharp whack with another rock. There was no anesthesia, no pain management beyond a stoic acceptance of the agony. In many groups, there was likely a shaman or a medicine person who served as the community's doctor. This individual was part herbalist, part spiritual guide, and part person who was just brave enough to deal with the messy, unpleasant realities of the human body. They might have used rituals, chants, and perhaps even psychoactive plants to treat ailments, blurring the line between physical and spiritual healing. Was it science? No, but the psychological comfort of being cared for, combined with the practical application of herbal remedies, sometimes worked. In the end, healthcare in the Paleolithic was a combination of practical knowledge, community, support, and a whole lot of luck. You got rest, you got attention, and if you were fortunate, you recovered. And if you didn't, your spot by the fire and your share of the food went to someone else. Despite the constant, relentless pressure to hunt, gather, and simply not die, our Paleolithic ancestors still found time for something uniquely, profoundly human: art. They didn't have galleries, museums, or art critics uttering phrases like, "That's very abstract." What they did have were walls. Big, cold, dark cave walls. And apparently, those walls were just begging for a bit of decoration. The earliest known examples of cave art date back tens of thousands of years, with some of the most stunning and famous examples found in places like Lascaux and Chauvet in modern-day France and Altamira in Spain. These weren't just random doodles or mindless graffiti. These were masterpieces of the ancient world. The artists depicted the animals that dominated their landscape in their imaginations: powerful bison, graceful deer, wild horses, and hulking, woolly mammoths. These creatures were often drawn with a surprising degree of realism, capturing a sense of motion and life that is still breathtaking today. You can see the tension in a bison's muscles, the flick of a horse's tail. Some paintings even have lines or multiple outlines to suggest movement, like a primitive form of animation. Alongside the animals, we find other mysterious symbols, patterns of dots, geometric shapes, and most hauntingly, the outlines of human hands. What kind of tools did they use to create these enduring works? Nothing fancy. Their palette came directly from the earth. They used natural pigments like black from charcoal and a range of reds, yellows, and browns from ochre, a type of iron-rich clay. These minerals would be ground into a fine powder and then mixed with a binder water, animal fat, or even saliva to create a usable paint. They applied this paint in a variety of ways. They used their own fingers to draw lines, or created simple brushes from chewed-up ends of sticks, feathers, or bundles of animal hair. And in a remarkable feat of ingenuity, they invented a primitive form of airbrushing. They would fill a hollow bone or a reed with liquid pigment, put one end in their mouth, and spray the paint over their hand held flat against the cave wall, creating a perfect negative stencil. But the biggest question of all is, why? Why did they do it? Why would people living such a hard, marginal existence venture deep into the darkest, most inaccessible parts of a cave places they didn't even leave in to paint these images? We'll never know for sure, but there are many compelling theories. Perhaps it was a form of storytelling, a way to record a great hunt or to pass down knowledge about the different types of animals in their world. Maybe it was connected to spiritual or shamanic beliefs. Some anthropologists believe the art was part of a hunting ritual, a way of magically capturing the spirit of an animal to ensure a successful hunt. The handprints might have been signatures, a way of saying, "I was here," or they could have been a way of connecting with the spirit world that was believed to reside within the rock itself. The artists who created these works probably did so by the flickering, unsteady light of a simple stone lamp burning animal fat. This dancing light would have made the painted animals seem to leap and move on the uneven cave walls, creating a powerful, immersive, and perhaps terrifying experience. This wasn't just art. It was an event. They were making art purely for the sake of making it. There was no commercial gain, no Instagram followers, just a deep, human need for expression in its rawest form. But it's also likely that children got in on the action. In some caves, alongside the adult handprints, we find tiny hand stencils, suggesting that even the youngest members of the community were brought into these sacred spaces and taught how to make their mark, literally. We'll never know the name. of the first person who sketched a bison on a cave wall, but it's easy to imagine someone else standing behind them, grunting in approval, or maybe offering a few unhelpful critiques. What's truly remarkable is that this art has lasted long after the bone huts rotted away and the fire pits grew cold. Those painted animals still gallop across the silent cave walls, a vibrant, powerful proof that even 30,000 years ago, humans needed more than just food and shelter. They needed to create. Also, maybe they just really liked bison. After a long day of hunting, gathering, scraping hides, dodging wild animals, and parenting without the aid of sedatives, early humans finally got to enjoy a bit of what we might call downtime. Of course, Paleolithic social life wasn't exactly a series of wine tastings and fancy brunch dates, but it was the vital social glue that held the group together. And the heart of all social activity, the center of their universe, was the fire. Once the sun dipped below the horizon, visibility dropped to what you might call hope you don't trip over a sleeping dog levels. This is when the entire group would naturally gravitate towards the flames, drawn in not just for a party, but because it was the only source of warmth and light that didn't have teeth. Still, this practical necessity created the perfect setting for the tribe's social life to unfold. It was here that everyone came to eat, to talk, and to unwind. Evening conversations weren't idle small talk about the weather. They were rich storytelling sessions. People would share the events of the day, recounting a successful hunt with a healthy dose of exaggeration, or telling a cautionary tale about that one time someone almost fell into the river while chasing a particularly wily fish. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment. It was the primary method of education and cultural transmission. It was how knowledge was passed down from one generation to the next. The best places to find ochre, what to do if you encounter a wolf, the stories of the ancestors, the beliefs about the spirits of the land, all of this vital information was wrapped up in engaging narratives, complete with dramatic grunts, expressive hand gestures, and a lot of arm-waving. Music and dancing also made an appearance, though it wasn't exactly a coordinated performance. Someone might start banging two stones together in a steady rhythm. Someone else might begin to hum or chant a simple, repetitive melody. Then suddenly, three children would start spinning in circles because no one had told them not to. Instruments were simple and opportunistic. Hollowed-out bones could be used as flutes. A piece of stretched hide over a log could become a drum. And literally anything that made a vaguely satisfying sound when struck could be part of the orchestra. Was also a huge part of social life. If someone had made a particularly successful kill, they would find a way to mention it, repeatedly. If they had just finished crafting a beautifully sharp and symmetrical tool, they would casually show it off while pretending they didn't really care about the compliments. Social status in a Paleolithic band wasn't about wealth in the way we think of it. It was about skills. Who was the best hunter? Who was the most skilled forager? Who could lead the group effectively? And of course, who could keep the fire going without burning their own eyebrows off? And then there was flirting. Oh, it definitely happened. The dating pool was small, so romantic gestures were often subtle and practical. Sharing your food, especially a prized piece of meat, was a huge deal. It was a clear signal of interest. Giving someone a particularly nice tool you made, or helping them with a tedious task like scraping a hide, was another green flag. Romance was based on demonstrated competence and generosity, not on eloquent poetry. Partnerships and relationships formed slowly, usually with the quiet, unspoken understanding that you didn't throw a rock at me today was a pretty good sign that things were going well. Courtship was practical and probably involved more grunting than sonnets, but early humans managed to figure out how to form pair bonds and build families. These relationships were often long-term partnerships built on cooperation essential for raising children and surviving the harsh realities of their world. In this small, interconnected society, your reputation, your skills, and your willingness to contribute were your most attractive qualities. The social fabric was woven every night around the fire, through stories, shared food, and the simple, profound act of being together in the dark. Life in the Paleolithic world was governed by the tangible, the weight of a spear, the sharpness of a stone, the gnawing pain of hunger, the warmth of the fire. But their world was also shaped by the intangible, by a rich and complex inner life of beliefs, spirits, and rituals. While we can't know the specifics of their religions, they left no sacred texts behind. Archaeological evidence strongly suggests that our ancestors lived in a world that was enchanted, a world where the spiritual and the physical were deeply intertwined. Nature itself was likely seen as being alive with spirits. A particular mountain might be the home of a powerful guardian spirit. A river could be a living entity, sometimes benevolent, sometimes wrathful. The animals they hunted weren't just walking sources of protein. They were powerful beings with their own spirits, intelligence, and agency. A successful hunt might require not just skill and bravery, but also the respect and permission of the animal's spirit. This is one of the leading theories behind the stunning cave art we see. Perhaps painting a bison on a cave wall was a way to connect with the spirit of the bison, to honor it, and to enter into a sacred contract before the hunt. Death was a constant, familiar presence, and early humans developed rituals to cope with it. We have found clear evidence of intentional burials dating back at least 100,000 years. These weren't just simple disposals of bodies. In many cases, the dead were buried with great care. They were often placed in a specific position, such as a flexed or fetal posture. Sometimes their bodies were coated with red ochre, a pigment that may have symbolized blood, life, or rebirth. And most tellingly, they were often buried with grave goods, tools, jewelry, animal bones, and other objects that they might need in the afterlife. The burial of a skilled hunter with his favorite spearheads, or a woman with her cherished shell beads, implies a belief that death was not the end, but a journey to another world, another state of being. In many of these small bands, there was likely a key figure who acted as a bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds, the shaman. A shaman wasn't a priest in the modern sense. They didn't lead a congregation in organized worship. Their role was more direct, more personal. A shaman was someone who is believed to have the ability to travel to the spirit world, to communicate with spirits, and to harness their power for the good of the community. This could be to heal the sick, to ensure a successful hunt, to foretell the future, or to guide the souls of the dead. The shaman's journey into the spirit world was often achieved through altered states of consciousness. This could be induced through rhythmic drumming, chanting, dancing, fasting, or the use of hallucinogenic plants. In this trance-like state, the shaman would embark on a spiritual quest, battling malevolent spirits or seeking guidance from benevolent ones. Many of the geometric patterns and half-human, half-animal figures we see in cave art are thought by some researchers to be depictions of the shaman's visions, representations of the spirit world they encountered on their journeys. The so-called sorcerer figure in the cave of the Trois Frères in France, a composite being with the antlers of a stag, the eyes of an owl, and the body of a man, is a classic example of what might be a shamanic figure. These spiritual beliefs provided a framework for understanding a world that was often chaotic and unpredictable. They offered explanations for why the rains failed, why the herds moved, or why someone fell ill. They provided a sense of order and meaning in a life that was constantly balanced on a knife's edge. Rituals, from the burial of the dead to the pre-hunt ceremonies, helped to alleviate anxiety and reinforce the social bonds of the group. While we can only speculate on the details, it's clear that for our Paleolithic ancestors, the world was not a dead, empty space. It was a vibrant, living cosmos, filled with power, meaning, and mystery. And so, as the fire burns down to a bed of glowing orange embers, the long Paleolithic day comes to a close. The sun has long since vanished, and the darkness outside the small circle of light is absolute, filled with the rustles, chirps, and occasional terrifying howls of the night. The air inside the cave or the hut is thick with the familiar smells of wood smoke, roasting meat, and unwashed bodies. This is the final act of the day, a time for winding down, for final preparations, and for surrendering to a state of guarded rest. Dinner, if you are lucky enough to have it, has been eaten. It might have been a few pieces of roasted rabbit, a nourishing broth boiled with hot stones in a hide-lined pit, or whatever edible plants the foragers managed to bring back. The meal was shared communally, with people sitting in a loose circle, crouched on their haunches or cross-legged on the ground. They ate with their hands, using a sharp flake of stone to cut the meat, or a bone to scrape out the last bits of marrow. There was no formal etiquette, but there were definitely unspoken rules. You didn't snatch the last piece of meat unless you were the one who speared it, or you were very, very important. After eating, as the last of the food was consumed, the storytelling would begin in earnest. This wasn't just for entertainment. It was the tribe's library, their history book, and their Netflix, all rolled into one. The elders would recount the old stories, the myths of creation, the tales of the great spirits, and the legends of heroic ancestors. The hunters would relive the day's successes, their stories growing a little more dramatic with each telling. These narratives passed down essential knowledge, reinforced social values, and entertained the children, who would listen with wide, sleepy eyes until their heads began to nod. Sometimes there was music. A simple rhythmic beat from a log drum, a haunting melody from a bone flute, or just the sound of voices joined together in a simple chant. The music wasn't polished, it wasn't complex, but it didn't have to be. It was a sound that pushed back against the vast, cold silence of the night, a human sound that affirmed their presence in a wild world. It was another thread that wove the small community together. By now, most people were physically and emotionally drained. The day didn't leave much energy left for deep philosophical discussions or late-night partying. The children were the first to succumb to sleep, curling up next to their parents or in a communal pile of furs for warmth. The adults would linger a little longer, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight, staring into the flames as if they held the answers to tomorrow's problems. Or maybe they were just zoning out, a feeling that transcends time. Before the last person settled down to sleep, one final critical check was made. The fire, the unsung hero of the group, the person on the first watch, would make sure the flames were tended to. If they looked too low, a few more pieces of dry wood would be added. If the wind had shifted, a makeshift barrier of stones might be adjusted. And if someone forgot to do this vital task, they would hear about it first thing in the morning, when the entire camp woke up shivering and angry. Finally, sleep. But it was not the deep, untroubled sleep we know. It was a light, watchful rest, with one ear always open for the snap of a twig outside the shelter, or the cry of a child in the night. It was the end of another day of survival, a day of hard work, of small victories, and of quiet moments of connection. And as they drifted off, they knew that in just a few short hours, the first gray light of dawn would appear, and it would all begin again. In our journey back to the Paleolithic, we've seen that the life of our ancestors was anything but simple. It was a constant, intricate dance between survival and community, pragmatism and creativity. They were not the brutish, simple-minded cavemen of cartoons, but intelligent, adaptable, and deeply social beings who navigated a world of immense challenges with remarkable ingenuity. From the moment they awoke in the cold dawn, their day was a relentless series of tasks: tending the fire, sharpening their tools, foraging for plants with an encyclopedic knowledge of their environment, and hunting with a combination of courage and sophisticated strategy. They built homes from the materials the land provided, cared for their children in the face of constant danger, and developed a practical, if basic, understanding of medicine. But their lives were not just about survival. They were also about connection. They gathered around the fire to share food, stories, and laughter. They created breathtaking art deep within the earth, not for any practical purpose we can be sure of, but for the sake of expression itself. They cared for their sick and buried their dead with reverence, suggesting a rich inner world of spiritual beliefs and a profound sense of community. The world of the Paleolithic was a world of harsh realities, but it was also a world of deep humanity. It reminds us that the core elements of our own lives, the need for food and shelter, the bonds of family and community, the drive to create and to find meaning, are not new inventions. They are ancient echoes, reaching us across tens of thousands of years from our shared ancestors who, against all odds, survived, adapted, and laid the foundations for the world we live in today.